Hello, we are here once again with our series, Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil. Within the section of the 4 romances of the King Arthur cycle, today is the final story. Let's talk about Merlin, the last but certainly not the least. A central character around whom the entire Arthurian cycle revolves. You know that, in fact, Merlin is the creator of the Round Table. From his powers and wisdom comes the inspiration for this harmony on earth. Of this great brotherhood of virtuous, valiant knights, led by a king shaped by Merlin himself, King Arthur. Today, then, we will learn a bit more about the story of Merlin. Professor Zimmer starts by saying something interesting about the West, mainly the Christianization. Managed to kill Celtic religiosity. But the legends, the sagas, the Celtic poems continue to permeate the medieval imagination for centuries. It reaches a point where you'll see, in the 16th century, the Council of Trent banned, placing one of the Arthurian ballads, which were the songs of Merlin, in the Index of Forbidden Books. Imagine that, this is the 16th century. How long did this endure, and how important was it in the human imagination throughout history? Righteous, noble knights, fighting for a cause that is greater than just physical life. The physical and metaphysical cause of honor, glory, and valor. And Merlin is the central point. We can say that he is the central axis of this entire collection of stories. We will then talk a little about how he emerged. Who was this character? A brief biography is sketched in this prologue, at the beginning of the story. He starts by saying that Merlin is the lord of the forest. He has the gift of metamorphosing and transforming into various forms. But he lives in an enchanted forest. Mysterious, his castle is the axis, it is the center, it is the core of the mystery. The center of this mysterious forest. And he was conceived in a rather peculiar and interesting way. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with this story. This ballad of the young Merlin, we can say, the boy Merlin and all the miracles that surrounded it. He said that his mother was a princess, a virgin princess, extremely beautiful, whose father locked her in a tower so that no one would defile her, no one would steal her away, because he intended to arrange a very advantageous marriage for her in that kingdom. It so happens that she, so beautiful, so pure, said that a spirit, an incubus, flew in through the windows of that tower and joined with her. The incubus was a male character who typically took advantage of the dreams of the oniric consciousness. And he would unite with women, almost like a vampirism, drawing their vital energy and germinating within them a mixed being. A being that is part man and part genie, part wizard, in other words, a being that belongs to 2 worlds simultaneously. And so, his mother became pregnant and was severely rejected by her own father and by the entire community. It is said that her father died of grief upon seeing his daughter pregnant. And she gives birth alone in that tower, with great difficulty, feeling much pain and deep loneliness. However, as soon as the child is born, the newborn itself begins to console the mother. He is born speaking and tells her that he is a very special being, predestined, that his birth was necessary, and that he would protect her. And, in fact, when she is taken to a court to be judged for the apparent adultery she had committed, he himself testifies in favor of his mother, stating that she had done nothing wrong, and that his birth was predestined and necessary. Logically, people fear him. How can such a small child have the gift of speech and speak with such authority, defending his own mother in a court? He becomes a child feared in that community. When his mother dies, he is left alone. And it becomes a bit strange, wandering around the corners, always searching for his herbs to make his magical concoctions. Everyone feared him. It happens that, around that time, in the community of the Bretons, who were those Romanized Celts. When Rome withdraws and leaves Britain to its own fate, the situation was very difficult. They were surrounded by other peoples, not very friendly. And without the strength of Rome to defend them, there was no way to protect themselves from the Picts. By Scots, Irish, Angles, and Saxons, in other words, surrounded by dangers on all sides. It was said that there was a king, Vortigern, who, to protect his people, felt incapable of doing it alone. He proposes an alliance with the Saxons. But those Saxons betray him once they're already inside the house. Within the British community, they begin to desecrate the homes. Respecting the women, they actually become the lords of that land. And the Britons, very outraged, because their king hadn't even given them the chance to fight for their land. For their dignity, he had brought the enemy inside the house. And there was a very interesting tradition among the Celts when a king was not worthy, because every king was the husband of the earth. You and the earth are one. When a kingdom was worthy, the entire land was like Fernando Pessoa. And it was necessary, then, to wed the land to another worthy king, to make the house with another sacred husband, with another worthy king. The Druids, who were more powerful than the kings, were the instructors and guides of the kings. They decreed that the king should be killed. And Vortigern, knowing this, quickly gathers his court, his closest people, those knights who were loyal to him, and flees northward to a place where he felt safe. And there he begins, commanding the construction of a fortress, a region already quite far away. He commands the construction of a fortress. Every time they started building, the construction would collapse, the ground would shake, and it wouldn't stand upright. And then his Gregorio de Matos, his magicians, 2 magicians he had brought with him, didn't know how to solve that. Then they told him, look, it's necessary to make a blood sacrifice. It's necessary to take an orphan child and Socratic Ollie to calm the earth. Well, all right, if that's necessary, let's go after it. There wasn't much consideration for mercy, and they searched in the nearest community to see if there was any child suitable for such a purpose. And nearby lived Merlin, who was a child feared by everyone. Can you imagine the relief of that community when they handed over Merlin and got rid of him? And Merlin goes calmly, knowing what was destined to happen to him. When he stands before King Vortigern, he says, look, these 2 magicians of yours don't know what they're talking about. In truth, they can't explain what's happening here, and my sacrifice won't solve it either. What happens down there is that there are 2 dragons, one white and one red, fighting beneath the earth. And the fight between them causes the earth to tremble. And this fight actually represents your royal house against the house of Pendragon, which was another noble family that at that moment aspired to take over the throne in Britain, which had been abandoned, but as long as the king wasn't dead, the other couldn't rise. He says, this battle between these dragons, I can pacify it, but not the battle between your royal house and the house of Pendragon. Inevitably, sooner or later, they will come here and defeat you. The king, despite the omens not being favorable, sees that this young man knew much more than that teenager. He knew much more about magic than his own advisors. He takes Merlin as an advisor, and Merlin casts a spell that allows the construction to be completed there. But, as was foreseen, Uther Pendragon, sooner or later, would show up there, and indeed, he did. And he defeats Vortigern, and Merlin becomes his advisor. It was the dream of forming a king who could unite that land, all the countless British communities that were there, so they could withstand the invasions coming from all sides. Merlin then goes back with Uther, and from there, he begins to shape Uther, to educate him to be the king who unites all the lands. But Uther's passions, his passion for a young woman named Igraine, who was the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, was one of the kingdoms that needed to be united. His passion for this married woman. causes all the unity that had been achieved until then to be lost. But Merlin never stopped believing that the Round Table was possible, that Camelot was possible. So, through his magical arts, he facilitates a union between Uther and this woman, Igraine, the beautiful. And when the two come together, he sets the condition that the fruit of that union, the child that would be born, would be his, would be given to him. Uther, madly in love, agrees. And so it is done. When the baby, Arthur, is born, he is handed over, as a newborn, to Merlin. And he takes him, and will shape and educate him to become the future king. Since Uther had not proven himself worthy. After all this, we know that, at a certain moment, Arthur reveals himself as the rightful heir, pulls the sword from the stone, faces the lords of the land, supported by Leodegrance, who is the only lord of the land to support him. Leodegrance was under attack. He supports him, manages to defeat the other lords, and brings peace to that war. He takes as his wife Leodegrance's daughter, who is Guinevere, and establishes there. Thus, Camelot, and within Camelot, its castle, and within the castle, a round table where the finest knights in the world would sit. It's an interesting detail because there are those in other works make an association between the Knights of the Round Table and the signs of the zodiac. And Leodegrance would correspond exactly to the sign of Leo, the one who ensures good governance, the one who guarantees strong leadership. He is the first to allow Arthur to be recognized as a king. Well, continuing with this story, Zimmer makes a point to highlight something interesting, that these characters had a historical existence, or at least it seems so. This isn't something that's so unanimously agreed upon, but there are many versions that claim it actually existed. A Vortigern, when Rome withdrew and left that land to its own fate, the Breton kings would have struggled greatly to establish a certain sovereignty, to protect themselves from invaders. There might have been, indeed, a Merlin, for whom there are many possibilities of who he might have been, with other names even being suggested. He becomes almost an archetype of mysterious wizards in all the tales that emerge from then on throughout the Middle Ages. He goes by many names, but Merlin is a character of reference. There might have been a Uther Pendragon, there might have been an Arthur. There, you will see that there are countless possibilities. Some call Arthur Riothamus, others call him Ambrosius Aurelianus. But the fact is that it seems there was a king who actually managed to hold back the Saxon invasion, the Viking invasion that came by sea, and he managed to keep Britain at peace throughout his life. At a certain point, he fights against his own nephew, who had kidnapped Queen Guinevere. He battles Mordred, and Arthur manages to defeat and kill Mordred, but returns seriously wounded, and seeks the Isle of Avalon to heal his wounds. Logically, this retreat to the Isle of Avalon represents his transition to another realm, to a timeless realm where it is said he waits. He waits for his knights to roam the world and call upon him once more, so that he may return to the land and re-establish the Round Table. The most righteous men in the world, gathered around a table, around a great circle, where the center represents the sacred. When the sacred returns to reign over the earth, Arthur is that king who was, is, and will be, and he awaits the opportune moment to return. Well, that's basically the story. He also tells, ladies and gentlemen, that Arthur too, here we are working mainly with Geoffrey of Monmouth in this story. He heavily draws on the Iona story, which is the history of Britain according to this writer Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he says that, according to this version, Arthur actually had 3 swords. One is the sword he pulls from the stone, which would not yet be Excalibur. A second sword, one he takes from a king, because when you fight someone and win, the weapons of the defeated become yours. And the third sword is the one brought from within the lake by the lady of the lake, Ninian, and given to him. That this would truly be Excalibur, representing the human will that emerges from matter. In other words, Now she works for the one, she works for the good, and no longer for material desires, to which she served when she was within the water. That is, within matter. Basically, he is going to talk about when Camelot is formed, and this story is quite interesting. He said that this is how Camelot completes its number of knights, which, in fact, initially are 11. The 12th is Lancelot of the Lake, who would arrive a little later, and the 13th, which is the center, is the Siege Perilous, where only Galahad would sit when his time comes, Parsifal, Galahad, or Parsifal, various names for a single character. The 13th, the son of Lancelot and Elaine. Anyway, it is said that when the union of the best knights occurs, the table is formed when Arthur completes his marriage with Guinevere. They sit and make their oath to put their sword at the service of anyone who is wronged, of everyone who suffers, of all the ladies who need assistance. And it is said that as soon as they finish this oath, a rather curious and strange event occurs. That, within the hall of the Round Table, suddenly a great white stag comes running, chasing after it a small dog, and behind several other hunting dogs. And blowing trumpets, the hunters come behind. At first, a beautiful young woman comes who condemns those knights for not helping to recover her little dog. Interestingly, when the stag passes by and the dog runs after it, the only one who takes action is Gawain. Gawain, quicker than a flash, grabs onto that dog and is dragged along with them in that wild chase. He goes along with them in that mad dash in pursuit of the white stag. The others are left perplexed, without knowing what to think. And this young woman comes and condemns them for not helping her recover her little dog. Arthur is a bit perplexed, because, in truth, he hadn't established a round table to chase after little dogs, of young ladies who lost their own dog. He was expecting something grander, like an adventure. And suddenly, a knight all dressed in black comes along, takes that young woman away, and that's it, everything is over. And they stand there, paralyzed, and ask Merlin, "Merlin, what was that?" "Those were spirits. They were specters. What's happening?" Then it says that Merlin falls silent for a moment. Suddenly, he removes the hood, and he had transformed into a young man with golden hair, wearing a laurel crown, and he says, "You cannot think that by establishing Camelot, you can fall into inertia, resting on the laurels of victory for having established this brotherhood. From here on, the adventures will come one after another. And when the adventures come, if you notice that this was somewhat magical, somewhat fairy-like, you must realize that the adventures are also mapped out on this plane. The only one who had no doubts, who didn't refuse because he thought the adventure was too small. For him, it was Gawain, who set out on his quest and didn't miss this opportunity. Do not judge opportunities as small. Do not think that only feats on the physical plane are necessary. In the end, the greatest feat is the conquest and mastery of oneself. And everyone falls a bit silent, pondering what Merlin had said. In fact, the Round Table had been established precisely for this purpose, for internal and external trials, to lead those knights to become great conquerors of themselves, great conquerors of their inner grail. Men not only brave and valiant, but wise men, worthy of entering the mysterious forest and finding Merlin's castle, worthy of delving into one's own unconscious, confronting all their flaws and emerging victorious. This is the big idea behind it. And finally, Zimmer is going to tell the end of Merlin's story. It is known that one day he meets a young woman, a beautiful young woman named Ninian, who had been brought into the world with the intention of seducing Merlin. She was like a kind of fairy, daughter of a mermaid, of extraordinary beauty, and he feels very drawn to her. And, gradually, he begins teaching his spells to this young woman, knowing that one day she would use this knowledge to imprison him. Despite this, he does not hold back. He keeps giving his spells away. Until this creature. Also a fairy-like being, this creature not very concrete, not very real. She ends up using Merlin's spell to imprison him on another plane. He suddenly awakens, as if he were in a bed, in a tower, and Ninian says that he was now her prisoner. She could come and go, but he had to always remain there. Later, when she herself tries to reverse the spell, it was so strong that even she cannot undo it. So, Merlin, from that point on, never returns to the Round Table. He leaves the space-time and enters a timeless world where he observes the adventures, the deeds, the sagas of men. They say that one day he would be able to break free from this prison again, this barrier, and return to the world. This is a very challenging and beautiful characteristic of the Arthurian cycle. He promises things for the future. He promises the return of Merlin. He promises the return of Arthur. When the tomb is found, or what was made to look like the tomb of Arthur and Guinevere, the tombs were empty, and it was written on the headstone that he would return. In other words, it's the idea that one day man will have enough honor, enough dignity for the spirit to reign again, within him and outside of him. Arthur represents the most spiritual and elevated aspect within each of us. When we reach the center, leaving behind a mere dimension, material, from a time governed by the clock, we will meet Merlin again. We will meet Arthur again. And so, in a very beautiful way, this cycle of Arthurian stories we've been exploring comes to a close. A very interesting opportunity was created by Zimmer, a collection of various authors. The classic authors, the most important works within this cycle, and several beautiful stories, all of them very good as a starting point for deep reflection. I hope you all enjoyed it. Next week, in our upcoming recording, we will discuss the king and the corpse. The next story in our sequence, as you know, we talked about the beginning. Initially, the name of this book was The King and the Corpse. It is considered the main story of this work. In the Brazilian version, it became Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil. It's quite an interesting story. I'm sure you're going to like it.